I think the last week we have kind of experienced the two approaches to China. So right around Thanksgiving, a day before Thanksgiving, we saw the release of Americans wrongfully detained in China, and we saw the release of Chinese in the United States, what was effectively a prisoner swap. So those Americans got to go home for Thanksgiving and be with their family after years of captivity. And the Chinese got to go back to China. We then saw the State Department lower its travel advisory from level 3, which is reconsider travel, to level 2, which is be careful, but you actually can go. Why that happened was careful diplomacy by the US State Department. It happened because President Biden, even though he was a lame duck, met with Xi Jinping, and they were able to negotiate this. So what we saw was continued engagement between the United States and China resulted in the freedom of these Americans. What we then saw Monday morning was, I think, the other approach, which is very possibly going to be the approach that is adopted. We saw the US government put out additional restrictions on exports of chips and equipment to make chips to China. A further tightening of rules which were initially put out in October of 2022. What then happened is the Chinese retaliated and banned the export of certain critical minerals, which is going to affect America's ability to produce chips and batteries and other things. So what that was, and I believe the Chinese are sending the message that should additional restrictions, should additional tariffs be put in place, we, the Chinese government, are not going to sit on our hands. So literally, here we are in the lame duck period, moving towards the inauguration of President-elect Trump, and we're kind of seeing the two possible paths. We need to get the China challenge right. And that is so important for the American people. In my view, too much of the discussion is what I would call, and what Michael Swain very aptly called, threat inflation. China is a challenge. Is it an existential threat where we need to completely decouple? I don't think the Chinese are going to be landing in Honolulu or in San Francisco or in New York, are going to so undermine the US government that it is actually an existential threat. It is a challenge. No question it's a challenge, but we need to right-size that challenge and figure out a way to measure the national security threat versus the consequences for the American people of the policies that we adopt. There's no question, I think, and I've spoken all over the United States, the American people should be and are willing to pay the cost of defeating aggression, but they shouldn't be paying the cost that inflating the threat makes them pay. So the first task of President-elect Trump's team is to actually reach a definition of national security. What's happened over the past few years is we always, when I say the Chinese, when I meet with Chinese think tanks, government, I say, 我们向你们学习. We've studied from you. We, the United States, have broadened our definition of national security to make it look much more like the Chinese definition. So we see legislation in Congress, the Biosecure Act. We see restrictions on sharing healthcare data. We see restrictions on AI, quantum computing. We see restrictions on subway, rolling stock of subway cars in Washington, D.C. we need to agree on what really is national security and what we can do together. Because the results of these policies are creating two separate ecosystems that will increase costs, duplicate research, stifle innovation. And the people who pay, the Chinese people, of course, pay for that, but the American people pay for that. We have, the National Committee has 7 Track 2 dialogues. Some of them, one, for instance, is on healthcare, and scientists and doctors from both sides get together. And what's clear is there is plenty of areas for cooperation that do not involve national security, that we can have regulatory harmonization, we can have data sharing, we can secure supply chains in the healthcare area. And the result of that is going to be better patient outcomes. Do patients really care if they or their relative have cancer, whether the cure comes from the United States or China? Jerry mentioned healthcare. Agriculture. Should we be, the United States obviously can export much more agricultural products to China. Shouldn't we be finding ways to do that and cooperate? Climate change is what Jerry also mentioned. We need to find ways where the national security definition creates a safe space for products related to environmental protection and climate change. And those are the things that would benefit the American people. When Jerry and I started out, and we were teaching in '79, we also represented the first group of US investors into China. And they were greatly restricted by the Chinese government in what they could do. Now, the shoe is on the other foot. The Chinese are prepared to invest in the United States, and the US government is restricting that investment. I would suggest that we actually adopt what the Chinese did in the '70s and '80s and '90s and finally are backing away from, but allowing that investment in non-national security areas so the Chinese actually create jobs in the United States through their investment and through their technology. And that would be an enormous benefit. One of the great experiences of my life was going to the place where my brother lived after he left the military service, Dayton, Ohio, after he left the military service of the United States. He went to Ohio State Law School, settled in Dayton, never went to China his whole life. And almost a decade ago, I was invited to speak at the opening of the Fuyao Glass facility in Dayton. And what I'd seen through my brother's eyes over all of those years was a hollowing out of Dayton. National Cash Register, General Motors, all these great American companies left Dayton. And the tax base deteriorated and the school systems deteriorated. And all of a sudden, this Chinese company set up the world's largest automotive plate glass facility in Dayton. And I saw the town being reborn. Dry cleaners and luncheonettes and other services around the factory were reopening. And I could see what Jerry and I saw 40 years earlier. I was seeing the Chinese do in the United States. So when President-elect Trump cares deeply about manufacturing and job creation, as he puts up this tariff wall, and I think we can rest assured there will be tariffs on the rest of the world, but especially on China. As he puts up these tariffs, shouldn't we find ways that these tariffed industries can invest in the United States and create the manufacturing jobs in the United States? EVs, AVs, EV batteries, storage batteries, solar panels. There's a whole host of industries which China could invest in the United States and create jobs which President Trump cares about. I think about infrastructure, and I think about the trade deficit. Back in the early days of the first Trump administration, we were talking about building LNG terminals in Texas so we could export LNG, which was basically produced in Texas and which the United States is in huge surplus in, and we could export it to China. And once again, this would help to balance the trade deficit and create a situation where people in the United States saw the benefits of a constructive US-China relationship. There are those who will argue that Europe needs our LNG and energy resources now. If President Trump succeeds in ending the war in Ukraine, the Russians will then supply the Europeans again, and we will need a place for our LNG and oil to go. There were a bunch of projects which, in Trump's first presidency, not only the one in Texas, but one in West Virginia and Alaska, which would, if they were implemented, would reduce America's bilateral trade deficit with China by an excess of $50 billion. So, Jerry, I think the question of what kind of policy we should have very much relates to what policy would best move the Chinese in the direction that we want them to move. So which policy would create restraint on Taiwan, restraint in the South China Sea, restraint in the East China Sea, better human rights policies? And that's the way we need to think about it, as opposed to overly securitize every aspect of the relationship and end up not with outcomes that benefit the American people, but outcomes which punish the American people. Obviously, there are lots and lots of little things that the incoming administration could do. But again, it's so I was in China. I came back just less than a week ago, and I argue, and I do it publicly and I do it privately. I said, the Chinese government needs to allow more American journalists into China. And I say it, and I say it to everybody I meet, because that will improve US-China relations. Also, the US government should allow Chinese journalists back in to the United States. So obviously I have not succeeded, but I think, okay, so what policies in the United States would get the Chinese to allow journalists back in? And a more constructive relationship, one which was not overly securitized, would do that. And I think that goes for just virtually every issue. If you're not characterizing China as an enemy, you have the opportunity to do constructive things and shape China's policy in a way that is more beneficial to the United States. I've gone on way too long, but you didn't cut me off. So
I wanted, first of all, to get your view on U.S. defense. The new policies that you and I are discussing doesn't mean we're forgetting about our defense. It need not mean that we're preparing for war, but it should mean that we're assuring an adequate defense for ourselves in Asia, but we should do it in a way that is not provocative, but in a way that just shows that we are quite aware things might go badly. So we have to have continuing effort, a greater effort, actually, if we're going to be secure in Asia, to defend our interests there, while at the same time undertaking this new effort to cooperate on those problems that are the most uncared for, but important, confronting the world.
Yes, we have to hope and work for the best, but prepare for the worst. There is no question, and no, again, when I talk about Chinese investment, when I talk about all these things we could do together, it's while we protect our national security, we can find ways to cooperate. And clearly, in terms of our positions in South Korea, in Japan, in the South China Sea, we need to maintain readiness.
There is national support for that part of the policy, surely. But what we haven't had is a parallel effort to overcome existing difficulties and at least assure us adequate protection of our interests in case the Chinese should decide to resort to force.
Yeah. And again, I think, you and I and, people who participate in our Track 2 dialogues, we have a Track 2 dialogue on maritime issues. And we are regularly calling on the Chinese to conclude a code of conduct for the South China Sea, which would then make it less likely that we could have a flare-up in the South China Sea. And we're able to do that because we maintain these channels of communications with our counterparts, and the US government should do the same, as demonstrated by the Biden administration in the prisoner swap and the crackdowns on fentanyl. So, it's important that, as President-elect Trump imposes these tariffs, that he keeps lines of communication open. I've urged anyone who would listen that President Xi and President-elect Trump should speak as soon as possible before the transition. I think that can lead to some constructive outcomes. And my hope is either that they've already spoken or they will speak in the near future. President-elect Trump cares about bringing jobs back to the United States, especially manufacturing jobs. And there are ways that we can do that with China. And I believe China is willing to work with us on that, understanding that the national security area is not one where we're going to allow any sort of compromise. But that's okay. It's not close to 90%, not close to 100% of what we can do.
It seems that the ultimate question is control of the Pacific. Is the United States going to be able to accommodate continuing Chinese progress in expanding China's influence in the Pacific? Are we going to insist on our long-run, almost century of command of the Pacific and learn how to share it with China as well as other countries?
I would distinguish influence from coercion. If China wants to give military aid, wants to give aid to countries throughout Asia, and they want to use soft power to influence those countries, I think we can't stand in the way of that. If China is sending its fleets to coerce the Philippines, to coerce countries in Southeast Asia, to coerce Taiwan, to coerce Japan, then I think we need to stand in the way and say, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. You know, Chinese who I see basically say the Pacific is certainly big enough for both of us. And they deny the assumption in the United States that they're out to be the paramount power in the Pacific. They just say that's American paranoia. My view of that is if it is soft power and you're trying to persuade people, we can't stand in the way of that. If it's coercion, then we should stand in the way of that. And we can draw, the United States is perfectly capable of drawing that line.
Competition could be very positive and to the benefit of all the other countries in the Asian area, if properly controlled. The Chinese are always talking about a new form of international relations. I'd like to challenge them and say we're ready to engage in a new form, which would mean cooperation on all the neglected areas that we all know are more important to the world than who controls which island in the South China Sea.
Yep. Which is why we advocate for signing of the Code of Conduct, because that then establishes all sorts of rules for the South China Sea, which I think would be very positive. And, you know, again, the people that we speak with don't reject that out of hand, but it's been many years and we have not seen the hope for progress.
Of course, that assumes that we can trust Chinese commitments in various treaty form, and that they believe that we will stick to what we're committed to under those obligations. And that means a lack of trust. It's fatal, and we've got to try harder.
Certainly the reclamation of the islands in the South China Sea was, you know, in the arbitral ruling that was inconsistent with the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, greatly damaged China's credibility in international fora. So that yes, can they be trusted? I think, you know, the answer is, you know, what Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. We can see what's going on. We have, I mean, so many things. You know, one of the few great successes in the last 10 years was the agreement to allow the audit of Chinese companies that are listed on US exchanges. So these audits now occur in Hong Kong, and they have by and large been successful and allowed those companies to continue to be listed. But audit can solve so many problems. We're worried about dual use technologies, our sale of dual use technologies. If China allows the audit of these technologies, then we could know which ones are truly going to civilian use and which ones are being shipped to the PLA. They're labor rights issues. Well, okay. The Chinese government needs to allow these factories to be audited to see if there is anything that is untoward going on. So audit, transparency is a very positive approach to US-China relations. And that's part of why I argue for US journalists to be able to go back and for Chinese journalists to be able to come to the United States. That creates more transparency. You know, the reopening, you know, is because during the Trump administration, the consulate in Houston was closed. And then the consulate in Chengdu was closed in retaliation. That doesn't help really anybody. Now, because the Trump administration created the closure to begin with, it would be kind of a very nice gesture if they reopened it. It would help people in the southwestern United States and would help people in southwestern China. The incoming administration has the opportunity to do some very interesting things. I think they're going to be very worried about national security. They're going to impose tariffs, but it may be in the context of their political base. They can do things which would be much more difficult for a Democratic administration to do.
Yeah. Well, let's hear from some of our distinguished participants. Hannah, do we have anyone who wants to speak?
I see we have so many friends on this call.
Not at this time, but as a reminder to ask a question, please raise hand icon on your Zoom window. And when we see your name, we will call on you to ask your question.
We might take the opportunity.
We have a question from Roy, if you want to start with that.
Go ahead, please.
Needs to be. Yeah.
I've got to unmute. Hey, Steve and Jared, really enjoyed these talks and really, really thought-provoking. I guess I'm struggling with a couple of things here, and I'll just throw them out and let you address them or as you see fit. I liked your idea, Steve, of being more creative and even acting very much like the Chinese acted when I was over in China in the early 80s all the way until 2000. But one thing I think might be something to consider on that basis is if we're going to have Chinese investment in America, do the same thing that China did to companies I work for, to have joint ventures. And in most cases, have it controlling by the U.S. side to alleviate some of these concerns, taking a page from that playbook. So I think that's a great way to start. But I think I'm overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem we have. This takes me back to, I think, what Harry Truman said: "There's nothing new in the world except the history you don't know." And I think we're back to the early 40s, and I think we have a situation where there is a power axis between Russia, the Middle East, and China, and we have to be looking for that lever that Nixon and Kissinger found with China at the right time to lever the issues with Russia and have the Chinese kind of ally themselves with us as well. I just don't see that. I also am very concerned about Taiwan, regardless of what anybody says. I think that the Xi Jinping is definitely going to make a move on Taiwan. It's historically there. He wants to do it, and it's going to be closing the revolution. And I'm not sure what we can do, what kind of power we can do outside of. One last comment I'll say is maybe set up and really have an Asian NATO as a way to prevent that as well. I know we had CETO at one point, but that seemed to fall by the wayside. But those would be my comments. But again, thank you very much. This is incredibly thought-provoking, and it's just really very timely.
Terrific. The first, maybe I wasn't clear. I was suggesting that what China had done to our investments in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, that is requiring joint ventures, not allowing 100% ownership, we should do the same to the Chinese today, that allow the investment to come in, but it has to be in the form of joint ventures. So I think that is an idea whose time has come, and it would deal with the national security hawks that U.S. folks would still be in control of these deals. And I think the Chinese these Chinese companies, these are private companies, would like to be in the American market. I think assuming President-elect Trump ends the war in Ukraine, that is going to have an enormous impact on geopolitical relations. So will this allow Russia to be closer to the United States. I expect that if the war ends, that many, if not all, of the sanctions on Russia will end. I assume there will be some level of commitment that NATO would not allow Ukraine to join. So Putin would therefore not have to continue his war of aggression. But what that means for US-China relations is very unclear. So if Russia draws closer to the United States, does it pull away slightly from China? In my meetings in China over the last 3 weeks, that was a question that was raised many times. The history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and Russia's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party is not a great history that the Russians often did in the Chinese Communist Party. So with that history, I detect a concern among Chinese that, wow, if Putin and Trump are this close, what does it mean for us? Because they have that history closely in their minds. With Taiwan, I don't agree with you that an attack is imminent. I think the only way that China, the PLA would attack Taiwan was if Taiwan and the United States did things which were so beyond the red lines that have been established since I was in the State Department, that it would provoke an attack, that we left Xi Jinping with no choice but to take increasingly coercive measures towards Taiwan, including potentially a blockade or something else. I'm hopeful. I think back to when Jerry's student was president of Taiwan. So when Ma Ying-jeou was president of Taiwan, we didn't have enormous cross-strait tension. We had increasing economic and cultural integration. We didn't have political integration, but we had that. And that was based upon this vague 92 consensus. So wouldn't it be great if Taiwan's leaders would figure out that this was in their long-term interests to have peace in the cross-strait area and not do these various provocative things, which seem to me to not do a ton for the people of Taiwan. So, when Speaker Pelosi goes to Taiwan, does that really help the people of Taiwan? It creates an enormous amount of tension. But the benefit is purely symbolic. So is that wise? So if we could go, if the Taiwan people and leadership decided that they wanted to go back to or go forward to that kind of relationship, that would preserve peace in the cross-strait area for the rest of my children's and likely my grandchildren's lives. So that would be good. Having said that, I'm not optimistic that the body politic in Taiwan is ready for that kind of action.
We will take our next question from Kenneth Wasserman.
Thanks very much for your discussion, Steve. In your questioning how the U.S. can shape China's policies, might you do a deeper dive on ideological issues? So to what extent might you advocate the U.S. should modify its ideological bias by reducing areas that focus on individual liberty and more greatly focus on areas that reduce economic inequality?
We have to, the American people want to stand for our values. We have to speak up for our values. Do we need to say that we would prefer that China be a democracy? I would say no. I am not a huge fan of this distinction between democracies and authoritarian regimes. I noticed that when the Biden administration invited the democracies to Washington, they didn't invite Singapore. Well, I'm not sure about that. Singapore's got its problems, but I don't think I would call it an authoritarian regime. So that distinction doesn't serve the American people well. We need to stand up for our values, but we need to understand when we're seen as interfering. If there is no international convention that dictates a standard, I think the United States is in a difficult position advocating strongly for a unilateral sanction on China for various things. Having said that, again, we had a great prisoner swap last week. We brought Americans home for Thanksgiving. That's a benefit. We continue to stand up for people in Hong Kong, for people in Xinjiang, and I think that's consistent with American values. I think the question becomes, what policy tools should we be using? So the consul general in Hong Kong cannot meet with the chief executive or the chief secretary of the Hong Kong government. So the number one and the number two people in the Hong Kong government can't meet with him. Is that in the interest of the American people? Is that in the interests of the people of Hong Kong? I would argue, I don't think so. I think it's more important that they can talk directly and influence their views by talking directly. Obviously, we're getting bad results in Hong Kong, but does that mean we should increase sanctions, or we should find ways to create platforms where we can have direct conversations?
Next comment, question.
We will take our next question from Lawrence Sullivan. Lawrence, we can't hear you if you're talking. Looks like we're having some audio issues, so we're going to go ahead to the next question at this time from Alfred.
Hi, this is Bill Alford, and what a treat to be there with Steve and Jerry. So,
Bill.
Great session. Jerry, you have seen, and I have a question for each of you. Jerry, you have seen and done so much over the years in human rights, in business, in public policy. I know your memoir is coming out soon. I wonder if you could, my question for Jerry, and I have one for Steve, if Jerry, you could share with us from the perspective of the many changes and things you've seen and your rich understanding of Chinese history, some further advice, for Steve, for myself, for the rest of us. So, what would you give us as advice about how to move forward constructively? And then, Steve, I have a smaller question for you, and that is, when you go to China and you meet with important officials, that great picture of you with General Secretary Xi, are you able to impress upon, not him, but lower level Chinese officials, just the ways in which China is self-defeating. So not allowing journalists in and then complaining that the American media is biased. I must say, every one of the dozens and dozens of Chinese visitors I've had this fall says that. You can't have it both ways, right? If you don't allow people in to report, of course you're not going to have accurate coverage. And I understand that even being there still has a lot of constraints for journalists, but just one example of the ways in which China's perhaps not realizing that it's cooking its own goose. And final quick thing, Steve, incoming Secretary of State Rubio still subject to 2 sets of sanctions from China. Any thoughts on how that gets navigated by both governments? So again, first to Jerry and then to Steve. And again, thank you both.
Thanks, Bill. What I would like to see is, after consultation with the Chinese, notice to them that the new administration is going to take a new position, one that will build upon General Secretary Xi Jinping's constant reference to new form of international relations, and tell it like it is. Tell it like we are facing these grave problems that are going unaddressed while we're being distracted by more minor problems, and that we should work on solving the minor problems, as Steve suggests, but we should make a huge effort, an effort that the world has not seen, of the 2 great powers deciding in a mature way that they will focus on the major problems that are as yet unaddressed and that may be more dangerous in the long run for mankind than those that immediately distract us of a lesser nature. So I challenge in the public speech by the new administration to see whether we can put our relations on an entirely higher, more positive basis.
That's why we love Jerry. He's always the optimist. Bill, the language that you used in your question is the language that I use when I talk with officials in China, which that these policies are self-defeating, and changing these policies not only benefit U.S.-China relations, but benefit the Chinese people. So, for instance, we had our Track 2 economic dialogue a couple of weeks ago in Beijing, and we talked about structural reform. We talked about increasing consumer confidence, getting consumers money that they're willing to spend. That, by the way, would be helpful to U.S.-China relations, to U.S. businesses in China. And I said, and it's good for the Chinese people. So the kind of, this is good for you. It also is tangentially, it's good for U.S.-China relations, but gosh, it's really good for the Chinese people. I raised the sanctioning of Senator Rubio. The uniform response, we will find a way around that. We will find a way around that. So I said, just again, it's a freebie, just unsanction him. Just say, okay, he's going to be Secretary of State. The sanctions no longer apply. Again, there are all these, what I call freebies, the cost to China, or the cost to the United States in some cases is non-existent, but you get these benefits. Seems very quiet. I was done.
Anna?
Don't have any raised hands at this time. Oh, we got one. Edward Baker.
Have I unmuted?
You are.
Good. Ed Baker, the Korea Institute at Harvard. We've seen a lot in the news lately about North Korea getting involved in the war in Ukraine to the extent of sending 10 or 12,000 troops there. Of course, North Korea has been selling arms to Russia for quite a while. And, I always think that it's a little bit out of place for the United States to get too exercised about the international arms trade, although I find it pretty disturbing, both the US and the others. But what do you think this North Korean involvement means? I don't think it's all that significant, but I'd be interested in knowing what the two of you think. When I say I don't think it's all that significant, I believe that at the drop of a hat, North Korea will have its troops, or whatever many of them survive the cannon fodder-like circumstances they seem to be in. They'll have them back in North Korea.
Yeah. I asked the Chinese, not officials, the think tank world, what they thought about it. They were not very happy.
Yeah, I can see that.
They seemed to, and it seemed, again, that this wasn't senior officials, it was think tankers, and they seemed concerned about it. They pointed out, as you did, Ed, that the bunch of them are going to die, and some had already died at that point. So, and they kind of go, it's concerning to them. The sale, so only China, at least the way it was explained to me, only China and North Korea have the same diameter shells as Russia. So they're the only two potential suppliers and the Russians use absurd amounts of artillery shells. So that has drawn the Koreans and the Russians closer. The Chinese refused and made a big deal of pointing out to me that they refused to sell the Russians artillery shells. That would be lethal aid, and they stayed away from that. But they don't seem very supportive of Korean troops in eastern Ukraine.
The Chinese have always feared Russian influence over North Korea would be detrimental to peace in Northeast Asia. And there's always been a quiet rivalry between Moscow and Beijing. It goes back, well, it existed when I first visited North Korea in 1972. There was great distrust on the part of the North Koreans of both sides, but they were tilting toward Moscow for a variety of reasons. China can't be happy with the use of North Koreans by the Russians, and this is a source of tension, and somehow the United States should become at least better informed on what's taking place and find out if that leaves any sort of an opening. But this gets back to conventional diplomacy. And I think we're in such a serious situation that we've got to inspire the Chinese, by whatever means we have, to join us at a higher level that would leave these other problems to be worked out over time and would be assuming that we'll get along in some of these problems and not on the others, but won't allow this to distract us from the new outlook. If Trump wants to make a real role for himself in history, this could be a path to it.
We will take our next question from Minky Warden.
Hello, gentlemen. It's Minky here.
Hi, Minky.
I want to say how happy it makes me to see you both together again. And I'm very pleased that you're taking up this topic. I wanted to ask, whenever I talk to young people from mainland China, I hear back that they are dismayed with what's happened in Hong Kong. And I'm reminded, Jerry, of how many roundtables you hosted with the Hong Kong leaders from all sectors of society, Gwyneth Ho from journalism, Joshua Wong, a student leader, Jimmy Lai, a publisher, and how many of those people who were at your roundtables are now in jail in Hong Kong or awaiting a kangaroo sentencing. I wanted, Steve, I wanted to ask if there was any indication on your visit about whether Chinese leaders understand the damage they're doing in Hong Kong in relation to Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China itself, and how important Hong Kong's rule of law, human rights, innovative spirit have been for China's own development.
The response, I raised it, and especially because the sentencing actually occurred when I was in China, I raised it and I said how counterproductive this was. They responded that this is not about rule of law. This is the rule of law in Hong Kong remains, that the judiciary is independent, that you can litigate whatever you want. You can sue the government. It's okay. But on this insurrection, they said every country prosecutes insurrectionists. And I said, I had said, geez, trying to run a primary is an insurrection. And they basically said, yes, it was done to undermine. It was as if they were reading from the judgment itself. So I got no indication that we're going to see improvement, and that they continue to believe that the aspects that foreign businesses that are integral to Hong Kong, that the aspects of rule of law that they care about are not about these insurrectionists. That commercial disputes, a state-owned enterprise with a foreign business, they say those are still litigated perfectly honestly, and the independence of the Hong Kong judiciary and the quality of the Hong Kong judiciary remains unchanged.
We will take our next question from Paul here.
Hey, Paul.
Hello, Steve and Jerry. Thank you very much for this session. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Steve, you've outlined several initiatives that I think are very great ideas for engaging with the Chinese on, lots of bilateral and transnational issues. But it seems that that kind of reciprocal constructive engagement with Beijing is not politically defensible or viable in Washington these days. My question is, what are the prospects that you can see for overcoming that resistance?
I think it depends on which one you're focused on. My view on so President-elect Trump cares about manufacturing. He cares about job creation. So if he is going to, and we know from the first Trump administration that the U.S. deficit didn't change at all as a result of these tariffs. What happened was manufacturing, which used to be in China, went to third countries. So the deficit just got shifted from China to other places. So you argue that, and the Secretary of the Treasury, the people around President-elect Trump care about this. You argue that, okay, we have this experience. So what you need to do is allow for Chinese investment to create jobs. So, okay, tariff EVs at 100%, fine, but then allow for these Chinese companies to build these EV factories in the United States. Same true of EV batteries, of storage batteries, of solar panels. There's a whole list of things that you can kind of build in the United States. My sense is there is among some of the people, there is a willingness to look at that. I think on the infrastructure side, you're bringing investment. So when I look at the projects from 2017 that literally they went to China to discuss this with Sinopec and others. I mean, it's a project. These are project finance deals. They were slated to occur in Texas, West Virginia, and Alaska. Well, maybe if one is really interested in it and looking for ways to decrease America's trade deficit with China, you could recruit these governors, all of whom are close to Trump, and you get them to advocate for these projects. Obviously, it's not something that I can do. You're talking about reducing the trade deficit over $50 billion a year when these are operational. And you're also talking about investment of billions of dollars. But when you get to Jerry's point, we got to do big stuff. And my sense is President-elect Trump wants to do big stuff. And these things, you can kind of get him to focus on and instruct the various departments that they should be supportive of those. Do I think it's likely, Paul? I don't, but it's not impossible. And we should be trying, because it's what President-elect Trump talked about, bringing manufacturing back to the United States, reducing the bilateral trade deficit. And these initiatives do both of those. Will we be able to get a definition of national security? It's tough. And if there's, to your point, if there's no political will to do it, then we're not going to get it done. But if there is some political will, so, you get doctors and scientists who say, we gotta have a definition in the healthcare area so we can have better patient outcomes for Americans. So maybe, the healthcare bureaucracy can get behind that. Climate change, when you put climate change together with China, those are not exactly two favored areas. So it's going to be tougher. But the audit idea, why should we not do that? And why should the Chinese not agree? So they tell us, well, we don't do any of this stuff. You're saying, fine, just let us audit it. So I've met with Chinese companies who are sometimes sanctioned, and they say, we don't do what the US government is accusing us. I said, fine. So let the US government send auditors in to confirm that is the case. So those kinds of things, I think the problem with implementing that is more the Chinese than the US government. My sense is, Rubio, Walsh, Ratcliffe, et al., they would be happy to send American auditors to China.
We will take the next question from George Conk.
You're muted, George. He's showing up as
Thank you. At Fordham, we've seen a substantial reduction in the number of Chinese visiting scholars and law students. What is your sense about the situation and prospects more broadly for academic exchange?
Well, it's a critical issue. It's going to depend on what visa policies are adopted by the incoming administration. My sense, again, it's a sense. I don't know. I guess I've had too many I don't knows in this whole hour conversation, but it sounds like STEM students are going to be Chinese students, especially those who have gone to any of the 12 military affiliated universities, are going to have a very tough time getting visas to the United States. I think law, history, social science, I can't understand why we would limit their ability to come to Fordham or elsewhere to study law. It's in America's interest to have Chinese law students matriculate at American law schools. It's just really hard to understand that theory. So I guess the theory is they're spying, but what are you going to spy on in a law school? Constitutional law? I mean, it's kind of, that one's tough. So my sense is they're going to come out with greater limitations on STEM students coming to the United States, which again, if you go to Silicon Valley, if you go to all of our tech companies, material percentage of the students were of the workers were originally from China. So that's going to be devastating to those businesses. And in my view, not the way we should go. The last point is, it seemed to me that President-elect Trump, so after a tighter initial screening, seemed to be more willing to give green cards to those who had come and gotten graduate degrees. So at one point, and it was not followed up on, he was saying that we should, I'm not sure if it was he or somebody in his campaign, said we should staple a green card to the PhD certificate. So the diploma. So when they get the diploma, we give them a green card, which would be good policy.
I think we shouldn't make assumptions about legal education. In recent years, one of the peculiarities has been very, very large numbers of Chinese have been admitted and have come here to get their Master of Law degree. Huge numbers compared to the past. And it was startling to me when Ma Ying-jeou came over here a little over a year ago, that the crowd of students from China was enormous. And this is something that I intend to study, because we need more comprehensive data, and we need then to understand, why are they here for this purpose?
It's a good reason why we should be allowing them to come. It was, I recall when they were allowing large numbers of tourists from China to come to Taiwan. This was when I was running my business in Taiwan. And, I would say, gosh, so they broadcast the legislature's arguments. And these people go to their rooms at night. Obviously, they all speak Chinese. They're listening to the newscast in Taiwan, seeing this very robust discussion of what policies should be in Taiwan. And then they go back to the mainland, having kind of witnessed firsthand this democracy on Taiwan. It was so interesting, and I thought a great thing for cross-strait relations.
Well,
There are no raised hand at this time, but as a reminder to ask a question. Oh, we got some more.
I was going to ask Jerry a question, but I'll let
That
someone else go first. Go ahead.
All right. We'll take the next question from George Hogan.
Hello, this is George Hoge of Chesham Investments in Boston. There have been a number of papers focusing on the China shock and its impact on the U.S. economy. And my question has to do with your assessment of the willingness of the Chinese to further grant access to their own market and to revise the policies that are in violation of WTO practice, and whether at this moment they also might be ready for a larger deal.
I think the Trump threats have the beneficial effect of making China more willing to open those sectors. So when I was in China just recently, I said, there are a lot of openings that are still left in the foreign investment sector. There are industries that still are not fully open. Just open them. It's not only in the interest of U.S.-China relations, it's in the interest of the Chinese people to give them more selection. I think that will be possible. I think some of the failures to live up to WTO commitments, it's late. So if I think about, my former industry, financial services. So, the insurance sector is kind of like 1 or 2% foreign owned. It was supposed to be open. We expected it to be 10 to 20% by 2020. But now it's become a more mature market, so it's tougher to get in. The payment processing, so Visa, MasterCard, American Express had all applied from 2001, and finally, only recently, they have granted MasterCard and American Express access, mostly through joint ventures. But again, the market has become mature. It's tough when it's a mature market. It's tough to get market share. Banking, investment banking, the same story. I had hoped, I'd lived through the Big Bang in London and in Tokyo when they opened these markets to multinational investment banks and banks. And guess what? The Americans became dominant because we're better at that. China never really did that. They should have. And if they really want to have market reform, financial market reform, allowing U.S. companies to operate, U.S. investment banks, et cetera, to operate in China would be a wonderful first step. And it would create confidence. It would be good for the Chinese people. Would there be a few losers? Yes, there would be a few Chinese companies that would lose market share to U.S. companies. That's okay. They should be willing to live with that closing the market is so damaging to the consumer and to U.S.-China relations.
We will take our next question from Roy.
Hi, Jerry and Steve. I just had one question I forgot to ask you. Since you have your ears to the ground there, and maybe I missed this, I missed the first couple minutes of your presentation. What do you hear in terms of President Trump appointing a Chinese ambassador from the U.S., an ambassador to China? We had a great run of really strong folks in the past, and I was just curious if from Ambassador Hummel to Lord and all the way down to Nicholas Burns. But do you hear anything? Is there anything? I mean, he's got an ambassador already chosen for France, and it would seem like this is a pretty critical position to fill.
Yeah, he's got one for the Court of St. James and France, but not China. I think it's a tougher job. Maybe there are fewer volunteers, but I've heard nothing.
I hope he won't select someone whose appointment is regarded as an insult to the country involved.
There are no raised hands at this time.
I had my question for Jerry, because it's kind of the perfect circle. So I saw an announcement that Paul Weiss is closing its Beijing office. You and I set it up with Jamie Horsley in 1981. So after we left Couder Brothers, how does that make you feel?
Well, I have been detached from law practice with the firm for over 20 years. So I have an ample basis for feeling detached. I don't know what the reasoning behind this was. I don't know that it means other law firms are likely to throw in the towel. Of course, keeping an office in Hong Kong, some keep an office also in Shanghai, still permits them to play an active role to the extent there is business cooperation. But this may be simply a reflection of the hard economic facts that having a foreign office, if you don't have the investment banking possibilities that one has in setting up an office in London, for example, is not a prosperous thing to do. And it may be a reflection of the fact that there are so many people now involved in the practice of law relating to China that it's no longer distinctive. We were doing the first or second thing. It was a fascinating time. It was business to be done, and we were a small group. But today the situation is very, very different.
Yeah, the article said it was part of a host of major global law firms closing their Beijing office. It mentioned a bunch of other names and said it was a combination of Chinese firms being able to perform that function and then combined with a simple downturn of business that foreign internet global law firms used to be able to do. But, I actually watched it, with all the things going on, it made me sad. I mean, there was a part of me, even though you've been gone 20 years, I've been gone 40. So I haven't practiced law in 40 years. So I felt a bit nostalgic as I read that and said, gosh, it's the end of an era. We set those up in the belief that there would be business forever. And here the firm in New York is deciding there is no more business, or there's not enough business to justify being there.
Especially now that we have a large number of Chinese who are trained in law outside of China, as well as in China. And we knew that day was coming. We knew that we had to deal with it. I personally think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
We have a question from Lawrence Sullivan.
Still not hearing you.
Sorry, Lawrence. I don't think we're getting your audio. Back to you, Jerry.
Well, the question is, how realistic is it to call for putting Chinese-American relations on a new level, a higher level, and one that would be responsive to the obvious needs of the world? And that will depend upon, of course, the people around Mr. Trump. Steve, could you tell us what we know so far about those people being considered?
They tend, so if you look at, obviously Senator Rubio is sanctioned by China. Congressman Waltz has a very tough but educated, these people know China in a lot of ways, and you know, now Mr. Radcliffe they know China. They know China. They disagree with the conclusions. They think that China is an existential threat, and we need to adopt policies which keep that threat down in a way and protect the American people. What I think we need to hope for is a discussion of the costs. So we need to discuss the threat. We need to, as I started off saying, we need to right-size the challenge and then talk about the cost to the American people of these policies. You know, I was on a call early this morning with the Peterson Institute that's done a study of the cost of the chip restrictions on sales to China. It's $100 billion, more than $100 billion. What does that do to the chip companies and their ability to innovate going forward? Because you know R&D is a percentage of revenue. So if you don't have that revenue, your R&D budget is decreased and you lose your competitiveness. You know, I think, you know, the other aspect, so we haven't mentioned the Congress. The Congress is certainly going to restrict, even if President-elect Trump wants to do things constructively, will the Congress allow him to do it? I'm not clear. And the last question we haven't talked enough about is our allies. So are our allies going to, and partners, are our allies and partners going to be willing to go along with us on increasing restrictions on dealing with China? I think that isn't clear at all. When I look at all these restrictions, and I know that we are no longer sole source. The United States is not the sole source of a lot of these products. Well, are we getting the agreement and a fully enforceable agreement of the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Dutch, and others to go along with these restrictions? And it's not clear to me we are. And I think President-elect Trump will be very sensitive to having American businesses lose jobs because of restrictions, which ended up pushing the business over to our allies and partners. He doesn't see the allies and partners as critical as I think the Biden administration did. So I think we'll probably see an approach where if we're going to have the restriction is going to apply to everyone, not just to American businesses.
We have time for one more question or comment. Hannah?
There are no raised hands at this time.
So, Steve, how would you like to end this? Do you think it's simply dreaming to call Xi Jinping's bluff and say, we are both headed on the wrong direction? Let's put it on a different level.
I think President-elect Trump will view this differently from President Biden and his national security staff. And I think he will have conversations with the general secretary, and he will probably explore the possibility of a China that benefits the American people more. And I think that is consistent with his campaign. It's consistent with why he was elected. So I think, you know, should we advocate it? I think we should put it out there. You know, we at the National Committee want to be helpful to the our new government on January 20th, and we'll continue to have our channels of communications. And when we have these dialogues, we always present the results to the U.S. government, to the executive branch, to the Congress, and we will, of course, continue to do that on January 20th. So, you know, I would use the Chairman Mao quote that I'm so well known for in China. You know, 在困难的时候看到成绩，看到光明，提高我们的勇气 in times of difficulty. Look at your record, and I think, you know, peace since 1979 in Asia is quite a record. I mean, I got my start during the war in Vietnam. So look at the record of what our relations with China have brought. They may not have brought terrific economic situation, but they have brought an Asia which for 5 decades before was at war and hasn't been at war since I left the U.S. State Department in 1979. 看到光明, look at the bright side. You know, I think you got to be, as I said of you, Jerry, you got to be an optimist. And then last, 提高我们的勇气, which is boost up your courage. You know, don't be afraid. I say that to Chinese all the time, and I say it to Americans. You know, if you're certain you're right, you should be courageous in what you do. And you know, that we are for communication and education. I am very comfortable with that.
欢迎来到6度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的6度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，6度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是6度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的6度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在6度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。